Hi, and welcome to our unit on social cognitive theory. Here are some questions that will guide the lecture in this unit. Some of the key concepts we will discuss in social cognitive theory are reciprocal causation, modeling, and social learning. And we will also touch on self regulation, but we'll only do so at a very limited level because we will discuss self regulation elsewhere in the course. A few key questions that are answered by social cognitive theory are: how are people's behaviors, the external environment, and their internal beliefs all related to each other? How does reinforcement model explain people producing behavior they've never seen or never been reinforced for? And how do a person's beliefs mediate behavior, and how important are they to the learning process? Let's take a look at the assumptions and key concepts in social cognitive theory now. Now, I know we're talking about social cognitive theory here in this unit, but I think it's helpful to have a little historical background on the development of this theory. Before we go on to discussing social cognitive theory in more detail, I'd like to take a moment here to pause and think about what we know about behavioral theories of learning. If any of you took an introductory psychology course at any point in your educational career, you might remember learning about behaviorism. Behaviorism is a group of theories that are focused on how the environment exerts influence on behavior. So you might remember classical conditioning with the Pavlov dog study or operant conditioning with the Skinner box studies. Either way, the important point here is that behavioral theories emphasize that the environment is what changes behavior, and behavior, or changes in behavior, is how we conceptualize learning. So, for us to get people to engage in particular behavior, we might consider offering some type of reinforcement or reward, or we might remove some sort of obstacle. I bring up this brief travel back to time to Psych 101 because social cognitive theory essentially retains the principles of behaviorism, but then expands upon them. Rather than just conceptualizing learning as a change in behavior, social cognitive theory has a more dynamic and more expansive view of learning. Pictured here is a model of reciprocal causation, also called triadic reciprocity. The model shows how the person, environment, and behavior all influence each other. Note that social cognitive theory emphasizes the role of the environment in behavior, just like behaviorism, but also includes the person's beliefs and mental processes. The person is the individual whose thinking process we are examining at the moment. For example, if we were looking at a workplace example, we could make the person in this scenario a particular employee or stakeholder group. The behaviors we would be examining then would be the behavior of that employee or group, what he or she does or the group does. The environment then would then include all influences in the environment that could affect the individual's thinking and beliefs as well as their behavior. Examples might be their supervisor, the physical context they are working in, their coworkers, and so on. We could then switch, if we wanted to, in looking at the supervisors as the person in the model, which means supervisees or the people who work for them would then become part of the environment. Note the dynamic nature of this model. Rather than just a unidirectional arrow from environment to behavior that we see in behaviorism, the arrows are bidirectional, which emphasizes the interactional nature of each of these influences. So if we think about perhaps a classroom example, we might see how a person's beliefs might be influenced by the teacher or their dissertation chair. If we were thinking about an employee, we would think about how other employees or how supervisors or coworkers influence the worker as well. The blue arrow in the model shows the emphasis in this model on self-regulation, how people can regulate their own thinking and thus change their thinking or beliefs, which in turn interacts with the environment and a person's behavior. Let's apply the model to an example. Let's say we're looking at the learning process of EDD students and the things that might influence their learning in the program. There are a variety of environmental influences outside of the student that it may influence their own self-efficacy and confidence and goals, such as feedback from instructors, work demands and schedules, the amount and type of support from peers or family, or the amount of support provided by the university or school, just to name a few. All of these things have an interactional relationship with the student's beliefs and perceptions, as well as their behaviors. For instance, let's say that a student comes into the EDD program with low self efficacy in terms of their writing ability, and they're really anxious about their ability to do well in the program. They come into the program highly anxious about writing their dissertation and their ability to complete the program. Because of this low self efficacy, the students perhaps will seek out help from other resources to help with their writing. In other words, these internal beliefs, the anxiety, influences their behavior, the help seeking. This behavior of seeking help from other resources then increases the feedback they receive on their writing. The feedback is an environmental influence that then in turn increases their self efficacy, but also increases future behavior by increasing the number of times the student will seek help in the future. The continued help seeking also helps the student feel less anxious. Again, note the dynamic nature of this model in terms of the reciprocal nature of the influences in this scenario. When changes are made in the environment, it not only affects behavior, but also changes in behavior also reciprocally can influence the environment. Take a moment to pause here and read over the assumptions of social cognitive theory. Note how some of the assumptions about the environment's impact on behavior are seen here, but also included here is the social component of this theory. It is called social cognitive theory for a reason. Instead of assuming that learning is only influenced by the environment, we have an added component of looking at the social nature of learning and how it changes our beliefs and our thinking as well. From a social cognitive perspective, we believe we can learn by engaging in the behavior ourselves or by watching someone else perform the behavior. In other words, we learn a lot of things that we may never act upon. So learning can be immediate, delayed, or never displayed. Also note the role cognitive processes play in the assumptions of the theory, especially on beliefs about learning and beliefs of ourselves as learners. In social cognitive theory, goal setting is very important as an aspect of learning. It's a central process in self-regulation, for instance. When learners are self-regulated, they monitor their own learning, change the conditions of learning, change learning events and environments, and modify the task to make it harder or easier. Given the social focus in the theory, it's important to point out how things like reinforcement, rewards, and punishment have several direct and indirect effects. In social cognitive theory, the effects of reinforcement and punishment will likely depend more on how the person interprets the rewards or punishments and how such things are related to our prior experiences. Given the social focus in this theory, a key influence on learning in social cognitive theory is observational learning and the use of models. The models in observational learning help us determine how we should behave, which behaviors are acceptable or not acceptable in situations, and can help motivate us. For instance, seeing a model receive a reward or being punished affects our motivation to also either receive the same rewards or avoid punishment. Think about things like awards or recognitions given to people. Seeing these rewards can influence others to increase positive behaviors, even if they are not directly rewarded. They just have to see that others are being rewarded to influence their own behavior. So modeling then helps facilitate desired behavior or responses. Modeling can also contribute to people's expectations of what is the expected or desired behaviors. And for observational learning to take place, the learner has to attend to the modeled behavior. They have to retain that behavior themselves. Then they have to produce that behavior. And then they also have to have the motivation for engaging in that behavior. Models have to have certain characteristics to be effective. Not all models are created equal. In order for models to have the most impact on observational learning, models should have these characteristics. Note that the models have to be perceived as having these characteristics in order to be effective. Competent models are those who can perform the skill successfully. They can display skills correctly or are competent in certain areas of expertise. It's possible to have models, for instance, that are perceived as too superior or too competent. For instance, having a world-famous concert pianist teach an introductory keyboard class might not be the best idea. The best models are people who are equal or slightly more competent than the actual learners. Credible models. Credible models tend to practice what they preach. They act consistently with the behaviors they model. They also think about how we say that think about how we say how actions are more powerful than words or verbalizations. Observers also need to perceive models as being similar in some way. Similar models can affect our self-efficacy. It's the whole, if that person can succeed and I think I'm similar to that person, I can also succeed. Similarity is particularly important for new tasks or tasks people have difficulties with. Perceived value is more important than age. In other words, we want to see that the models value the same things we do. Similarity also arises when you're choosing mastery versus coping models. Mastery models can perform faultlessly. Coping models, on the other hand, may have some initial difficulties or fears or problems, but improve their performance over time. To promote higher self-efficacy and performance, it's best to have multiple models, both mastery and coping models. If that's not realistic, then the preference would be a single coping model followed by a single mastery model. More positive and enthusiastic models enhance learning and motivation by potentially raising self-efficacy. You do want to be wary of enthusiastic and charismatic models who are not competent. Sometimes having a model who is chosen because of their personality only may lead to something called what we call educational seduction, or observers may believe they learned something from a very charismatic model who might give the illusion that they are learning when they actually aren't. So choosing a model simply because of their personality isn't going to be as effective as having a model with additional competency and has other characteristics listed here. And finally, fair and supportive models are important characteristics. Models that are perceived as being unfair, biased, or unsupportive are unlikely to be helpful in the learning or motivational process. Let's talk now about the principles and implementation strategies along with social cognitive theory. These principles and implementation strategies can help guide you with what you want to actually do from a social cognitive framework to address problems. Here are the principles of social cognitive theory. These principles show us the relationship between different factors in learning. They can be worded into if-then statements to guide strategy use. For instance, you could turn the first principle here into an if-then statement by saying, if you model to-be-learned strategies or behavior, then learning and performance will improve. Note the importance of the use of models in social cognitive principles. These principles stem from the assumptions on the social nature of learning, the interaction between person, environment, and behavior, and the importance of self-regulation. So we just talked a little bit about modeling and the benefits of modeling with the right models. Obviously, so using models is a great way to improve learning and motivation, and one of the principles of social cognitive theory. Don't also forget about how there are indirect benefits from using reinforcements or punishments. So seeing someone be rewarded or alternatively punished for particular behaviors can indirectly affect the beliefs and behaviors of others. Again, the social nature of this theory is in evidence in this principle that addresses how learning is actually achieved through observation, that individuals need to first mentally organize and practice behaviors they see, then actually practice those activities. Remember to keep in mind the characteristics also of effective models. And finally, don't neglect one of the most important elements of self-regulation in the theory. Keep in mind that we discussed self-regulation elsewhere in the course, as the literature on self-regulation is quite extensive. Elsewhere in the course, we will also discuss self-efficacy theory. Although self-efficacy is also a part of social cognitive theory, it too has a very extensive body of research as a contributor to motivation and has been studied extensively in a variety of professional fields. And finally, remember that feedback is a key element in social cognitive theory, and such feedback should be private, specific, and timely in order to maximize learning, motivation, and performance. Let's take a look now at some implementation strategies from a social cognitive viewpoint. Take a moment now to pause to review the strategies here. As you look over these strategies, keep in mind some key ideas in social cognitive theory. First, remember that new learning and performance may be revealed over time and that it's important to teach basic knowledge and skills to mastery. Second, models can be helpful in the learning process. Third, helping individuals self regulate their learning and performance is also important. And please make sure to show that incentives are within reach to learners. I want to end the lecture here by briefly talking about assessment. No focus on learning would be appropriate without some discussion of assessment. So let's take a moment to talk about how we would utilize a social cognitive lens for assessment and evaluation. Here in social cognitive theory, assessment reflects some of the social aspects of learning and how individuals regulate their learning. Right? In behaviorism, things were like observational checklists are used to assess behavior. The same is also applied here, but also with the added component of using self-observation as a form of assessment. This self-observation aligns with a focus on self-regulation in social cognitive theory. And then given the focus on self-regulation in the theory, encouraging goal setting as a standard for assessing performance is encouraged. So individuals should set their own goals, and then performance against those goals can be a form of assessment. Also, allowing small group tasks or performance as a performance measure is appropriate. Given the social nature of social cognitive theory, such collaboration can be helpful, particularly on difficult and challenging tasks where the collective knowledge and skills may lead to higher performance and or motivation. And finally, set in any initial assessment at the individual's current level of task confidence with gradually increasing tasks and assessments.